Emerging markets have hit a new bout of turmoil. With me today is Esteves, Chairman and Chief Executive of BTG Pactual, the biggest investment bank in the emerging markets, based in Brazil. Mr. Esteves, what is going on now with emerging markets? We've seen the Argentine peso fall off a cliff overnight. We've got problems in Thailand. We've got issues in Turkey. How do you see the development of the emerging markets over the next year or so?
Yeah, well, first on a general term, it's another cycle as we had volatility concentrated in developed markets. Now we have some volatility in emerging markets. I do see on the long run still fantastic perspectives of emerging markets, because the true story of emerging markets is not about commodities or a specific sector or another. It's the transformation of these countries into middle class countries. So this secular trend is still there and full of opportunities.
But is this about politics right now?
No, I think the specific events, and you mentioned Argentina in Latin America, for example, which is probably the most relevant of the recent events. It's in a certain way, it's a mix of weak economic policies and migrating to a better regime in terms of effects, which is a more transparent price formation regime. And of course, countries generally do that in a situation of weakness, as Argentina is doing.
So you see this as a positive?
I prefer a floating rate regime with market rules and transparent price formation. That was happening. Argentina was living in practice in a dual currency regime, which is on a long term unsustainable and mistransparent. It's not good for the society.
And is there a risk of contagion within Latin America from this, or is this a very isolated issue?
Oh, I think for a while Argentina has been a little bit isolated of the financial community. So emerging markets are volatile. You mentioned Turkey, so the events on Turkey are more important for Brazil than the events in Argentina. Of course, Argentina
Why is that?
Argentina is a more relevant trading partner and important neighbor and important relationship to Brazil. But as I said, Argentina was more isolated.
Right.
Turkey is, let's say, mainstream emerging market. So, by
so
no
you mean
means.
From a sentiment perspective, Turkey's more important, but from a trade perspective, obviously,
yes,
you're a neighbor,
yes,
so that's more important.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about Brazil in itself? I mean, Brazil has had some economic issues. A couple of years ago, it was so hot for investment that they were putting up barriers and trying to stop investment coming in. You know, now the miracle has kind of disappeared somewhat. The market's been challenging. The currency's been weak. You know, what do you see as the big issue that Brazil faces right now?
Oh, I think this moment of excess optimism probably was a little bit ahead of the fundamentals. And in a certain way, I think the excess pessimism today is also a little bit ahead of fundamentals. We are probably, our fundamentals are in the middle of these two worlds. I like the economic response of Brazil at this stage. We are tightening monetary policy, anticipating this more adverse world, anticipating tapering and normalization of monetary policy in the centralized economy, especially in the central economy, especially in the US. And so it's important. I think what is missing is a little bit more tight fiscal policy in Brazil. If we have that, we have honestly a very good response.
Okay, and when it comes to tapering, I mean, it's obviously happening now. It's very clearly flagged, and there's been a bit of instability around that in emerging markets. I mean, as the U.S. Federal Reserve reduces its bond purchases, which is tapering, to what extent do you think that has a continued impact, or has that already been factored in?
I'm talking about the whole process. I think tapering is just the beginning of that, but sooner or later, interest rates will normalize. And this implies in this change of relative prices. And what emerging economies need to do is prepare for that. And that's why I do see with sympathy this change in policy mix in Brazil that is occurring right now. And you need just to show discipline and commitment to stabilization. And no secrets, just another cycle. And in a certain way came because of a very good reason, which is normalization of economic activity in relevant economies.
Brazil have a, a more fundamental problem that it needs to address around infrastructure and about actually improving that to take the economy to the next level? And is that being addressed properly?
I would say, I would put a little bit different. I would say that we have a productivity challenge. And that's our challenge. That's the agenda for the next 10 years, is increase productivity in our economy. Part of that is infrastructure, but it's also the tax regime, it's also education on the long run. And that's the agenda that we need to address. In terms of macroeconomy, we need to move the instruments that we have, but we have a solid macroeconomy. What we need is to achieve a new level of development, improve productivity. That's
to what extent
agenda.
has the consumer borrowing particularly run ahead of these things? I mean, are you at all concerned about that?
No, I'm not concerned. Credit expansion in Brazil is getting moderate right now, so I don't see an excessive credit growth. What happened is that the economy grew too much based on consumption, and I think a more balanced mix between consumption and investment, it's what is required. And in order to have investment, you need to have productivity. So that's the change, and that's the mix that we need to search for in the next 10 years. So
let's talk about your bank for a minute. So you've taken this bank to be one of the biggest investment banks in the world, the biggest in emerging markets. You originally developed it, you sold it to UBS, you bought it back again. Is it true, the rumor that during the crisis when you bought it back, you actually talked about bidding for UBS as a whole?
No, I think that there are always a lot of rumors in financial markets. No, our strategy
but was that rumor
is
true,
simple.
or was that rumor not true?
No, it's just rumor.
No.
Okay. It's we are consolidating Latin America as a full-fledged investment bank platform. We think that the financial landscape for the future will be very, very few global firms competing with some local champions, and we have, I think, good conditions of being a local champion. And we also develop certain business units on a global scale, like asset management and commodities. So that's the strategy for.
But how ambitious are you? I mean, this rumor around UBS, people see you as an ambitious person, and that would obviously have been a fairly ambitious move. How big do you think you can get as you see the other big global investment banks pull out of things like commodities? They're under serious regulatory constraints. Do you have an advantage that you face less of those regulatory constraints and you can go into some of these markets?
It's important that to mention that the regulation in Brazil was tougher than in US and Europe. What's happening now is that this negative arbitrage is neutralizing. Okay. So the world is more or less moving to similar status of regulation, different characteristics in each jurisdiction, but the same level of regulation. So the idea is keeping the partnership. Our key difference from the global investment banks is that we kept the old model. So we are merchant banks, and our bankers are the owners of the bank. And don't forget that in Brazil we have unlimited liability. So if something goes wrong with the bank, my house is ready for the creditors, and I live in a nice house.
I'm sure you do. So but on that model, I mean, the big shift in the US and UK potentially banks is that they've had to pull back from proprietary trading, from taking positions, and the Volcker rule it's still slightly in flux, but that's going to definitely make an impact. You're not changing your model. You're still doing a lot of that principal investing and that sort of merchant banking, as you say. That's not going to change. No,
in emerging markets, I think the political environment regarding this principal investment is very different from US and Europe. Our political spectrum in Brazil or Latin America, and I would say even for most of the emerging markets, both governments or opposition, they like very much the idea of a bank that could provide capital for the corporate sector move to the next stage. People like this idea, which, by the way, is pretty reasonable and extremely useful for US and Europe 150 years ago. So this merchant bank model.
But do they like the fact that brings a certain amount of risk with it as well? which is the fear that obviously with the crisis in 2008, the reason that the banks in the US have been pulled back is because of that.
Yeah, but we don't take retail deposits, right? It's it probably should be appropriate to have two categories of banks, and we are in a category that we are wholesale, and we use our capital, we are low leverage, and probably it's appropriate for the economies and very easy to regulate and monitor.
Okay, just final question. You've talked about emerging markets a bit. There are some pockets of instability, but broadly speaking, you think that the most emerging markets will continue to grow well. Where do you see, you do business in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere, where do you see the most interesting environments right now?
You have pockets of challenge and pockets of opportunities. If you look, for example, a relevant part of Latin America is still growing with enormous stability. If you take Chile, Peru, Colombia, in a certain extent, even Mexico, countries are growing, promoting reforms, open their economies even more, and navigating through the cycles extremely well. So I like this part of the world at this moment. Soon I think also the mix of economic policy will change in some of big emerging markets. I do see India, Brazil moving into the right directions, and worried about providing investors with good opportunities. So the emerging world is still a very good place to do business.
Still the place to be. Great.
Yeah, a good place to be.
Mr. Esteves, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay.